Hello, viewers. Welcome to the final episode of Tata Katha, wherein we have the renowned author of the book, The Tata Group, Dr. Shashank Shah, with us today. Hi, Shashank.
Hi, Girish. I can't believe we finished 4 episodes and we are now on the last one of Tata Katha.
Yes, and this is going to be an exciting one because today we are going to be discussing controversies that have surrounded the Tata Group over the years. And as you are aware, that for such a large and revered institution, the Tatas have had a fair share of controversies as well. Be it from
Yes.
the episode at Telco Pune, followed by the alleged payoffs to Ulfa, the run on Tata Capital, the shifting of Nano Factory from Bengal to Gujarat, the Nira Radia tapes, and all these examples. However, after each of these setbacks, Bombay House has emerged stronger. Now, therefore, what can managers and entrepreneurs learn from each of these crises and from the manner in which they were handled by the Tata Group?
Yeah, so you're right. Any story wouldn't be complete without looking at quote unquote crisis, challenges, difficulties, dilemmas. And same has been the case with the Tata Group because they've been around for 150 years. And that's not a short span of time from any lens. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about three crises from the last 3 decades and what learnings we'll be able to get from that, especially entrepreneurs, managers, leaders in different corporations. And the learnings are not a one-size-fit-all kind of learning across these crises because each of them have a different context, a different geography, a different time period, a different reason why they emerged. Some are micro reasons, some are macro reasons. However, there are lessons from all of them. So let me take the Tata Nano and Singur example to start with. It's much in discussion even now as we are recording. The elections in West Bengal are going on. And even now, almost a decade after Tatas have withdrawn from Singur, there is a conversation in many TV channels where I see the conversation around what would it have been if Tatas would have established their plant there, and the impact that would have had on the local ecosystem in terms of livelihood creation, in terms of spurring the economic engine, in terms of better quality of life for the people, vis-a-vis the land-related controversy that had emerged in a direct fight between the ruling left government under Buddhadev Bhattacharjee and the opposition party, which is the Trinamool Congress under Mamata Banerjee. So I thought I'll start with that, but mention very briefly, because most of the learnings, most of the facts with respect to the controversy and the crisis are in the public domain. And it was a time when 24/7 TV channels had already come into place. So most of the things have been documented. But here are the learnings from both the sides with respect to Nano. So I had asked this question to Mr. Ratan Tata when I had interviewed him for my book. And I asked him, what has been your greatest failure? And his answer was that my greatest failure and my greatest success both have been Tata Nano. And then he went on to reflect on why that's the case. And he said that it is the greatest success because the innovation of Tata Nano got the group unprecedented global recognition as the Indian conglomerate manufacturing the $2,000 car. It was unimaginable to manufacture a car at $2,000. And that unimaginable task was being done by an Indian company in emerging world. This way back in 2005. So at that time, the image of India was still that of a country coming out of a long period of government regulation and controls, etc. So we all know that the car failed. So that was the biggest failure. It was a commercial failure. And the relocation of the plant from Singur in West Bengal to Sanand in Gujarat caused an 18-month delay in fulfilling the 2 lakh fully paid orders Tata Motors had received for Nano. And that was one of the factors which caused the failure of the car, because in the intervening period, there was immense media speculation. And despite the production beginning at the Pantnagar plant in North India, they were not able to fulfill the fully paid orders. And competition fueled a lot of rumors around Tata Nano, its performance and safety. And all of this put together impacted the car sales. And of course, the media hype around it being the cheapest car did not go down well with the prospective customers who were buying Tata Nano or any four-wheeler as an aspirational purchase. And they did not want an aspirational purchase to be a lakh takiya, as they say in North India, or a lakh rupees car. You don't buy a car, an aspirational purchase after spending a decade or so in your profession, and buy a car which is known for being the cheapest car. So that kind of a tag also had a lot of impact on the commercial potential of the car. And both of these contributed to the failure. I mean, three of these points. And why was it the greatest success? I mentioned about the innovation. But in popular perception with respect to Singur, Tata's leadership was perceived by and large as willing to negotiate with all the stakeholders in a transparent manner. It reached out to the state government, it reached out to the opposition parties, it reached out to the farmers, it wanted to reach out to the leaders of the this movement, anti-Tata movement in Singur, all of them. However, when things didn't go right, when things went beyond control, their people's lives were at stake. And I've covered in an entire chapter in my book on the Tata Group as to how these things did not pan out well, and why did not they pan out well, and how the Tatas were almost held to ransom, and why they walked out. So Tatas did lose out. It was a phenomenal opportunity. It was thought to be another once-in-a-century moment for the automobile industry since Ford's launch of the T model, almost exact a century ago. In 1908, Ford had launched the T model, and in 2008, Tata Nano was launched. So they thought that it was another landmark once-in-a-century event, but that did not happen. But the principal political party, the Trinamool Congress, didn't benefit either. While they gained leadership in the state in terms of 2 terms back-to-back, and now they've completed 10 years as the ruling party in West Bengal, they were not successful in attracting investment in the state to the desired levels. And they were not able to revive the industrial levels to the pre-left government levels. Mind you, West Bengal was one of the preeminent manufacturing hubs in India. Most of the companies at that time had their headquarters in West Bengal and in Kolkata. It was a thriving manufacturing location before the 3-decade-long rule of the left government. But the Trinamool Congress wasn't successful in going back to those years. In fact, between 2010 and 2014, the state saw a 97% decline in industries. And the outstanding debt of the state under Chief Minister Banerjee increased from 1.8 lakh crores to over 3 lakh crores, which was a 64% growth. And the state has an annual interest burden of 45,000 crores. So that's the kind of difficult financial situation the state has been in. We usually don't look at the financial ramifications of some of these populist political measures. They are taken in order to come to power, but the kind of collateral damage that may have occurred because of that is not undone. So that's one of the major learnings from the Singur case with respect to Tata Nano and the transition of Tatas from Singur to Sanam. But I'll also elaborate on 2 other crises, one each from the 1980s and from the 1990s, which the millennials would not have heard about. And there isn't much material available in the public domain because these were not the times of 24/7 media reporting. It was more of a print media. And most of the old archival newspapers are not in the public domain. You have to go into the libraries and look up those years in order to find out what exactly happened. In my case, because I'm also consulting editor with Business India, I had an access to all their archives of the last 40 years. So I was able to look at some of the reports of those years and try and find out what is it that was happening and what was the media's perspective to some of these things, while I also got first-hand information from the Tata leadership. So the Rajan Nair case, as it is called, or the strike of the decade as it was hailed at that time, had joined, Rajan himself had joined Tata Motors, which was then Telco, in 1976. He was an excellent orator and had received immense support from the workers, and within 6 years, he became the general secretary of one of the unions. However, his services were terminated in early 1988 because there were several indisciplinary cases on the campus against him, and he left, swearing revenge on the management. And because that was his single point agenda, he continued his anti-telco activities and started controlling several unions outside the company. He also managed to get people elected, his people elected in the next round of elections at one of the Tata Motors union. And their only demand was that Nair should be accepted as the workers' leader, which was dismissed obviously by the management because he was the problem creator. It was also a time when Tata's top leadership was in transition. Mr. Suman Mulgaonkar, who was the chairman and managing director, wasn't keeping good health. And Mr. Ratan Tata had just then taken over as the chairman of Tata Motors or Telco from Mr. Mulgaonkar. And when he visited the plant in early 1989, the workers had called for a tool-down strike in order to attract his attention. However, the high point of this whole crisis was in mid-March 1989, when Nair's men assaulted and even stabbed 21 telco personnel across different parts of Pune. And that was a very gruesome situation, a very gruesome act. And Ratan Tata threatened to withdraw operations from Pune if any Tata personnel were harmed. And the major headlines during the year-long dispute because the Pimpri-Chinchwad industrial belt was having 2,000 industrial units, and Telco was one of the leading companies operating in that belt. Today, Pimpri-Chinchwad, we're talking about 30 years back. Today, Pimpri-Chinchwad is one of the top 20 cities in India with respect to population because of the very, very proactive industrial development that has happened there. And Tata has led from the front when they established the telco plant in that area. So then Chief Minister Mr. Sharad Pawar became quite concerned because if the lead company threatens to move out or moves out, it will have a direct impact on the entire ecosystem. Because mind you, several units, ancillary units, several wholesale units were set up because of Tata's presence there. And that would have a direct impact not only on the economic development there, but also on the collection of taxes. And you know what it is. It's a cycle, and it's a chain, virtuous cycle, vicious cycle, whichever side of the platform you are on. So he was very concerned, and he called for a tripartite meeting: the government, the Tata Motors management, and the union. And both Mr. Tata and Rajan were present. And both of them refused to compromise on their basic demands. Nair wanted to come back and be the leader, whereas Mr. Tata stood on matters of principle. And so when there was no resolution in sight, over 3,000 workers supported Rajan and announced a hunger strike at the Shaniwar Wada, which is a historic site in Pune, Shaniwar Wada Fort. And there were threats of self-immolation and burning of state transport buses by the protesters. And that's when the government realized that this is taking a serious turn. And so they launched what was called the Operation Crackdown before the whole thing would become uncontrollable and there would be violence. So at in the dead of the night, at about 2:30 on the 7th day of the strike, they surrounded the venue, and they brought out all the 3,000 workers in an evacuation process, which went on for almost 14 hours. And this was seen as a successful thwarting of the strike, and the media hailed Mr. Tata's victory. But the retaliation from the workers' side continued, and they announced an indefinite strike. And as a result, Tata factory had to be closed. I'm elaborating in great detail so that we know what are the various hues and nuances as to how these crises emerge, right? Would you like to share something? Is there anything you remember of those times which you'd like to add before I proceed?
I remember the media covering the meeting between Rajan Nair and Mr. Tata. I remember the media covering the police crackdown, but what I did not know was the stabbing of the people engineered by Rajan Nair.
Right.
And that is something which I have come to know through this session. But yes, I think the way that episode turned out was also hailed as a very unique situation for the Tatas because they have always been worker friendly. They are the ones who have proactively gone ahead and launched multiple schemes in India even before they became fashionable in the West, specifically at Tata Steel. So for the Tatas to therefore be faced with such a unique situation at Tata Motors was one difficult for the organization, of course. Second, personally difficult for Mr. Tata because he was the vice chairman of Tata Sons as well as the chairman, I think, of Tata Industries, and was in a sense, in contention for the top role at Tata Sons. But I think it also demonstrated to the people at large that companies can stick for principles and for what they believe is right, and that they cannot and will not give into Gundaism and hooliganism.
Right, right. It was actually an early victory for Mr. Tata because he had just taken over as the chairman of Tata Motors, and
All
when
right.
to win over the violent elements within his worker base, it was hailed as quite a victory for him, an early victory for him because, as you said, he was just getting into the leadership position. But what happened subsequently is equally important. Mr. Prakash Telang, he was then the head of manufacturing at Telco. He later went on to become the CEO of Tata Motors. He shared with me how Tata Motors management had appealed to engineers and white-collar people within the company if they would be interested to work on the shop floor and help in the manufacturing process. Because the workers had declared an indefinite strike, they didn't want to stay put and let the production suffer. And interestingly, all the white-collar workers, employees, and the engineers were willing to work. And to assist them, Telco hired temporary employees, temporary workers. So about 30% of the workforce who were willing to work but needed protection joined the team. Temporary workers were hired, and the engineers and white-collar staff joined, and production process began. And the company also got into some kind of an agreement with the other telco unions, and all the arrears of the previous 3 years were paid in lump sum, and over 2,000 workers had even accepted the offer. So you at least win over those people who are willing to negotiate and bring them onto your side. Get some temporary workers, use your existing white collar base to achieve your task. And within 2 months of the strike, Telco had achieved 70% of the original production capacity. Now, this was another headline. And the local papers published photographs of vehicles leaving the factory and the statistics of daily and weekly production. And the Nair group thought that this was a facade and that these vehicles were actually manufactured in Jamshedpur, but were being displayed as being manufactured in Pune. But soon they realized, as it was a continuing process, that the production was actually happening. And Nair, who had earlier claimed that he would crack the style of functioning of the management, he started conceding that Mr. Ratan Tata was a straight man, but he was misguided by the Pune management. Because remember, his main antagonist, according to him, were the management of Tata Motors and Pune, and not Mr. Ratan Tata, who was not in the picture when all the things against him happened. And one fine day, 2 months after the strike was called, all phones in the Pune factory started ringing at the homes of the senior management early in the morning. And the urgent message was that a lot of people, a lot of workers had gathered at the factory gates. And so the management thought that they were trying to block the entrance. In reality, the workers had returned to work. They wanted to commence work, and the indefinite strike had ended. Because like the non-violent movement for our freedom struggle, they had, without any kind of retaliation, the management had, through constructive and productive approach of starting manufacturing with whatever resources were available, had said that we'd like to work, we'd like to continue to deliver despite you, in spite of you, we will be able to achieve our tasks. So when the employees realized that their livelihood itself was at stake, they would have decided to come back. And Telco also after that brought in some changes. The Telco management realized that Nair had fueled cases of workers' disgruntlement with certain non-transparent decisions taken by their HR managers. And so the company decided that there would be a lot more contact between managers and workmen. The union or union leaders will not act as the intermediating agency between the two. And so they created several occasions to facilitate that, like organizing man of the month functions, having a suggestion box schemes, organizing departmental picnics, all of these aimed at having better interactions between management and workers. And they wanted to display to the employees through such practices that everything was being done in a transparent manner and that the workers' well-being was genuinely their priority. So that was a key learning for Tata Motors also. And thereafter, there hasn't been another strike to the best of my knowledge at Tata Motors Pune. So it is not important that there should not be a crisis, but it is definitely important that you don't repeat the same kind of crisis and that you've made changes for the better. So yeah, that's the example with Rajan Nair and Telco. Anything that you'd like to highlight, Girish, from your observations of that strike before I go to the next example?
Not of the strike, but of Tata Nano. When you gave that example, the visuals of the Tata Nano launch came in front of me. Okay. Wherein Mr. Ratan Tata's 3D hologram was shared on the screen. And he had said very ironically that before arriving at the name Nano, they had thought of naming the car as Mamta or In Spite Mamta. And there was tremendous response from the audience, if I may say, at that point of time. The launch was extremely well covered by the media. A lot of people had come to see the car, and many of them had come with 1 lakh rupees as cash in hand to buy the car there. And these were typically your villagers from Punjab. And they had said that hum to wo laktiya car dekhne aaye hain aur paise bhi lekar aaye hain. And that was the draw which it had at that point of time. I also think that the car did well, but it also got into issues because of the car getting burnt down on a few streets. And I don't know why that happened, but I'm sure Tata Motors did plug that up eventually. But it would have been a great car had it continued being there. Every time that I look at it on the roads, I remember the launch, I remember the passion with Mr. Tata got the car out. And I was a little sad that it did not go as well as it perhaps could have.
So now I head to the last example on the major crisis faced by Tata Group companies. And the next example is the Ulfa. And if there's anything you'd recollect, Girish, from those years, about anything that you would have read in the papers about the developing story around Ulfa and the alleged involvement of Tatas with the Ulfa militants.
I remember it being covered on the cover of India Today with Mr. Ratan Tata and Mr. Krishna Kumar on the cover of India Today, as well as the Tata Nano launch was on the cover of India Today. And that time there were certain allegations that the Tata management had paid some money to Ulfa, but the Tatas refuted that. And then I think subsequently it was also proven that there was no money that was paid by the Tata Group, and that a lot of managers of the Tata Group were under severe stress in Assam because of the actions of Ulfa. And a lot of families had to be shifted back, and only the managers continued being there on site. And none of the managers refused to leave the site because they said that no, they will stick around there with their workers.
Yeah, so some of the things you've mentioned are a part of the larger plot, and it's really like a film plot, the way the whole thing panned out. And nobody would have imagined that there would be so many nuances to this story. And I was lucky to have heard the entire story from none other than Mr. Krishna Kumar, who was the managing director of Tata Tea and who worked directly with Mr. Darbari Seth, who was the chairman of Tata Tea, and how this entire thing emerged and how several decisions they had taken at that point in time impacted the way things panned out. So this was in early 1991. At that time, militancy had started gaining the upper hand in Assam. And that was a very vital geography for Tatas in those years because the company had several tea plantations. The ULFA, or the United Liberation Front of Assam, had gained control over the southern banks of the Brahmaputra River, while the northern banks were under the command of the National Democratic Front of Bodoland, the NDFB militants. So you see, two banks of the Brahmaputra were under two different militant groups. It was quite a serious situation that Assam was in. And today, when the Assam elections are in progress and a lot of discussion is happening about the future of Assam, it would be worthwhile for people from across India to know that Assam has seen some very serious situations and has gone through a lot of turmoil for several decades. And in those years, it was common for the militants to demand what was called protection money or protection taxes per kg of the tea produced or per hectare of the land owned. And most of the tea companies were paying protection money to these militants. And this collectively amounted to about 100 crore rupees a year. And it was a common knowledge that in the past, big companies had been forced to pay such money to ensure the safety of their employees and their property in disturbed states like Punjab, like Kashmir, and like West Bengal. But the Tatas, as part of their values and code of conduct, refused to pay, even though one of their employees was killed by the militants in Nalbari in 1990. Mr. Darbari Seth, who was then the chairman of Tata Tea, had maintained that the Tata's policy was not to buy protection from militants, but to earn it through the company's goodwill with the employees and with the local community. And this approach worked in the company's favor until 1993, when Bolin Bordoloi, a Tata Tea manager and the youngest son of Assam's first chief minister, Mr. Gopinath Bordoloi, who is popularly known as Lokapriya Gopinath Bordoloi, who was really very popular and dear of the masses. And he was kidnapped. His youngest son, Bolin, was kidnapped from Guwahati. And the militants, the Bodo militants, had demanded a ransom of $15 million, which is nearly about 50 crores of rupees. This was a serious development, and the company decided that it did not risk the lives of 175 managers of Tata Tea that were working across the Assam Valley. And they were literally living like prisoners in the tea estates with the tea protection force of the government shielding them. So the company called all the managers to Kolkata and shared with them that the company was not able to pay the militants as part of its policy. And so, very conscious of the danger that the managers and their families were facing, Tata Tea proposed to them that their full salary and pension would be paid if they opted to retire and withdraw from Assam. And the company urged them to return to their native places. But interestingly, not one manager responded to that offer. They all said that they would stand by their duty. In the meanwhile, the Bodos gradually reduced their ransom requirements for Bolin from 54 crores to mere 5 lakhs, which was the amount they had spent in keeping him in captivity. But the Tatas refused to pay even that amount. However, they agreed to greater investments for the well-being of the Bodo community. The problem, this is very important to note, the reason why the Bodos had become militant and were revolting against the state was because their perception was about injustice being done to their community. And so the Tatas were willing to address these iniquities that they were perceiving about their community. And they were already managing a large number of healthcare and educational institutions in the region, almost 60 plus hospitals and over 400 schools and adult literacy centers across the state. And there was no hesitation at their end to invest more for the benefit of the community. So after Bolin was released after almost a year, Tata Tea helped set up a 65-bed hospital in the heart of Bodoland at an expense of over 7 crores of rupees. And that's when everybody thought that peace was finally achieved. But that was not the case. It was too good to last. And now, in a couple of years later, the focus moved from the Bodo militants to Ulfa militants. The Ulfa started demanding money from Tata Tea. And Paresh Barua was the chief of Ulfa, wrote a letter to Mr. Krishna Kumar, who was then the CEO of the Tata Tea company, demanding 100 walkie-talkie sets. And the company communicated all these details to the Assam government. They wanted to keep the government in the loop. But soon they realized that most of the information that they were supplying to the government was leaking from the Chief Minister's Secretariat. At that time, Hiteshwar Saikia was the Chief Minister of Assam. So one late night, Mr. Krishna Kumar received a phone call from someone who claimed that he is Paresh Barua, the head of Ulfa. And he said that he had all the information that Tatas were giving to the government and threatened Mr. Krishna Kumar. The Tatas realized that working with the state government alone was not helping. And so they decided to reach the Intelligence Bureau and interact with them in the central government. And The IB is the one which is the agency entrusted with matters pertaining to national security. So Krishna Kumar and his colleagues met the IB's directors several times, and every meeting was followed by letters to them, which were on record. So they ensured that there was an elaborate chain of communication between the company and the government on record. And the IB advised the Tata Tea on 2 counts. They said, don't pay militants in cash or kind, and continue the dialogue with them, else they will retaliate. So the Tata representatives met the ULFA representatives in different places, including outside India, in Bangkok, in Thailand. And they explained to them that as per the Tata Code of Conduct, they would not be able to pay any protection money to ULFA. However, they were willing to undertake work like building hospitals or providing jobs or even extending medical support. Finally, a medical aid scheme was introduced to the satisfaction of the ULFA representatives, which was funded by the Tatas, through which any Assamese could apply for hospitalization within and outside Assam. And for all of this, the IB, which was a central government agency, was kept in the loop. Now this whole story takes an interesting turn. A year into this scheme, the scheme was launched, it was being utilized, the locals were being benefited. But a year into the scheme, one of the patients whose name was registered as Bonti Barua, she was treated for a pregnancy-related blood disorder in Mumbai. And she was actually found to be not Bonti Barua, but Pranati Deka, the cultural secretary of ULFA. And she, along with her baby and her accomplices, were arrested at the Mumbai airport. By then, Prafulla Kumar Mahanta was the chief minister of Assam. And they were not kept in the loop because of the past experience that Tata Tea had with the chief minister's secretariat. And so the Assam government was furious, and they alleged a collusion between the Tatas and the ULFA. And this made major headlines in national newspapers because it was alleged that Tatas are funding the ULFA, which was a charge of sedition. And in fact, a couple of senior Tata Tea managers in Assam were arrested for waging a war against the state. There were headlines across major newspapers. Imagine Tatas, which is considered to be one of the most ethical and responsible conglomerates of India, they were being charged for treason by one of the state governments. The matter went to the Guwahati High Court. It eventually went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court observed that Tatas had approached the highest agencies of the central government and had kept the police, the Home Ministry, and all other agencies informed, and had provided all the supporting documents while engaging with the militants. They could not be funding the ULFA, and hence they were released. I mean, they were considered not guilty. They were ruled not guilty by the Supreme Government. The Tatas had actually acted on the belief that the central government will communicate with the state government. But this was an assumption which was considered naive by most observers in an era of coalition politics, where politics takes a precedence even over matters of national security. And while the Assam government considered the Tata's medical scheme as a conspiracy to support militants, many people in Assam realized that the real problem was the unflinching Tata principle of not paying. And yet this was an example of how a lot of trouble could have been avoided by just paying a small amount of money to the militants. When there were large corporations already paying a lot of money and were officially declaring that as ransom payment, Tata's actions being considered as seditious because they continue to engage with militants on the advice of intelligence agencies were considered to be smacking of a political witch hunt. And several industry observers considered Tata's decision as being pragmatic. They did not shut shop and move out because not only for the commercial reasons, but also because of the social objectives that they wanted to achieve for the local Assamese population. There were 20,000 laborers who were working in the 20 plus tea gardens of Tata Tea in Assam, and their livelihoods was at stake. The impact of that on the local economy was at stake. And so the employee safety and the fulfillment of the social objectives for the local economy and local community were being balanced by Tatas in a pragmatic way. So they received a lot of appreciation for it. This is also an issue where moral questions become core issues during decision making? Would you react by taking a soft option, or would you take a hard decision based on ethics? Because the true ethics is practiced in the most difficult times. In good times, ethics is preached and discussed, but when it has to be actually practiced, that's when moral issues emerge, and that's when the group's clarity, purpose, and adherence to core values surfaces in a substantial measure. And whether the values do play a decision, do influence the decision-making process, becomes very evident. It isn't surprising then that Lalu Prasad Yadav, the former Chief Minister of Bihar, who had an opportunity to interact with Tatas regularly, because then Jharkhand and Bihar were one state and Jamshedpur is in Jharkhand, and Lalu Prasad was the Chief Minister. So with first-hand experience, he said, and this is on record, he said, going for anything illegal to Tatas is like going to an Udupi restaurant and asking for tandoori chicken. You just won't get it. So that's the kind of communication that Tata sent out with their decisions, which were based on ethics, morality, and aligning with their core values. I think I'd like to draw a few key learnings from each of the crises the Tata saw, whether at Singur, whether at Pune, or at Assam. Each of them were in a different decade, in a different context, in a different geography, but has some common mantras which emerge. So first, the leadership of the company, the leadership at Tata's, whether at the company level, at the group level, always opted for a dialogue with the problem creators to resolve the issues. Very evident in all three cases. They wanted to have a dialogue directly with the problem creators to try and resolve the issue. And people right at the level of the group chairman were willing to engage. Second, they even opted for engagement with the highest authorities in the government and did whatever possible within the law of the land and in the interest of the nation. In all three cases, they were engaged proactively with the state government and in some cases even with the central government. Third, they were willing to help by resolving the issues faced by problem creators through social welfare measures. While they were not willing to break their code of conduct, but they understood the kind of iniquities or a sense of deprivation that the problem creators faced, and they were willing to resolve the issues faced by the problem creators. In Singur, they were willing to invest in the training, the skills training of thousands of local youth so that they could get jobs in the Tata ecosystem once the factory came up. Same was the case in Pune and Assam in a respective way. But the people were not willing to always oblige. The militants, of course, accepted the healthcare facilities that they opted. So, in fact, this is an indication to the government of the day that these are the issues where the problem creators are finding a problem. So, if we can provide the solutions, then these kinds of retaliatory measures would not be there. And finally, at no point in time were they willing to break the code of conduct and adopt any form of corruption or other illegal means. This is very important to note, that they stuck to the code of conduct, even if it meant losses, even if it meant moving out of the area, even if it meant giving up a line of business or a product, but they were not willing to break the code of conduct. I think that is something which really emerges very strongly from the way they've handled their crisis. Expediency doesn't help in ethical problem solving. With respect to Tata's, I clearly see three P's that they practice. The first P of patience, patience to resolve the issues following due process. In many cases, the problem was solved over several years, but they had the patience and they were following the due process. The second P is of perseverance. They persevered to engage proactively with all the concerned stakeholders, even if it meant giving precious time of the senior most leadership, but they persevered because they wanted to want a solution. And the last P, the third P, is purity. The purity of intention of the company, the group and its leadership with respect to the well-being of the community and society, with respect to the national interests, and also with respect to abiding by their values, helped them resolve most of the crisis. And in some cases where they were not able to resolve the crisis to mutual satisfaction, as we saw in Singur, they opted to let go and moved out while protecting their values and adhering to their code of conduct. So I think these are the key learnings from the way Tatas have handled their crisis for managers, for leaders, for entrepreneurs, and even for business school students as to what is it that it takes to be a real leader. Today, everybody talks about JRD with such admiration. Everybody, there are several pleas online to have the Bharat Ratna conferred on Mr. Ratan Tata. But it takes a lot to be that statesman leader that they have emerged to be. And the toughest decisions came in the time of crisis, where they had to stick to their core, and they did. And they developed the kind of respect that they have earned in the eyes of crores of Indians. So I think if that's what we want to be, truly exemplary leaders, this is the kind of mettle we'll have to develop. And this is the way we'll have to face up crisis with great courage, conviction, and with the 3 Ps of purity, patience, and perseverance.
That's a great example. Those are great examples that you have given, Shashank. Extremely insightful, and I fully agree and concur with the way the Tatas have handled it, with engaging the community, keeping the government in loop, and being very forthright and very righteous in the manner in which they have addressed each of these controversies as they have emerged. Now, also, if I may share, after the court gave the ruling on the Ulfa episode, I had also written to Mr. Tata, and he has been very kind to respond to that, and I still have that letter, and I have framed it here with me, as you can see. Yeah, and Mr. Tata has written, the Tata Group has always prided itself on its value system, and there is therefore no question of our compromising on the standards we have set for ourselves. There have been some occasions when we have suffered for our refusal to compromise, but I believe we have been more than adequately compensated by the faith and trust reposed in us by well-wishers like you. And this letter is dated 20th March 1998. I have framed it, and it's a very proud position which I have. Closer to the date, we have also seen the Supreme Court answering several questions on the Tata Group versus the SP Group, which I would call as a Cyrus Mistry affair, have on future boardroom issues that emerge in the corporate sector.